Sawadee Cup. Hello and welcome to another Victor Black podcast. Today's call is really going to be a somewhat more informal discussion, as it were, between myself and Dr. Todd Lee. I'm going to get Todd to introduce himself in a couple of minutes now, but just for for the framework of the call here, I would ask people that are listening to this to understand that Dr. Lee is first and foremost a medical doctor. Secondly, he's a biochemist, and we'll get him to drill into that in a little minute. Myself, I'm the bro. So this is a discussion where we're going to be exploring some principles and some concepts about the practical application of performance-enhancing drugs, with a focus really on trying to. My agenda here is going to be to try to dismiss the historical premise that different anabolic steroids have exponentially more anabolic potential than others. They were. So hopefully that will make sense as we go forward. So some of the people following this, Todd, will know who you are. You have a profile in the industry. I think that's fair. But can you just tell us a little bit about your background and your skill set coming into this conversation?
Well, without taking too much time, well, first of all, I really appreciate you having me on the show. That what you've contributed to our community, our tribe, as you put it, is monumental. And I can totally understand how frustrating it would be if people did not acknowledge you as the source of this new font of wisdom and how to safely manage gear protocols. And we'll get into that, and because I've got tons of questions for you. I'm a big fan. And but I am a IFBB pro who had been competing for about 15 years. I had retired from medicine to focus on bodybuilding due to I thought that the medical field was ultimately very corrupt in the United States. And in other countries in the world, it's a healthcare industry. In the United States, it is a disease management. And so insofar as it is incentivized to keep the patient sick and to keep them getting surgeries and getting medications, and the doctors are kind of absolved of any type of moral culpability because their education is provided in med school by the pharmaceutical companies. And the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, U.S. government work together to keep America sick and stupid, basically. Mm-hmm. And some people are going to think I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I think that we've learned in the past couple of years, shit's a lot worse than people realize. But that being aside, before I was a doctor, I was a biochemist. I've worked with multiple supplement companies. I currently own my own supplement company.
Some of the people listening to this will kind of have heard that language before, but just quickly, can you just explain what does being a biochemist mean? What does that mean in layman's terms?
Okay, so people are familiar with biology. People are familiar with chemistry. The human body is made up of tons of different chemical reactions at the atomic level. So to be a biochemist is to understand what's going on in the human beneath the physiological level at the atomic level. Like when you have a thought, what ions are passing through the neuron at what speed and at what voltage, and what neurotransmitters are transmitted to the other neuron for different emotions or for muscular control. It's acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic receptor, things like that. So nicotine would be a synthetic version of acetylcholine that is specific for the nicotinic receptor, things like that. That's what biochemistry is. So the entire supplement industry is based on an extrapolation of biochemistry. So pharmacology as a field is based off of biochemistry. Thus, anabolic pharmacology is an extrapolation not only on biochemistry and physiology, but also on endocrinology. So that being a doctor and a biochemist, I'm uniquely qualified to understand anabolic pharmacology. And as a IFBB pro bodybuilder, I've demonstrated I could utilize anabolic pharmacological agents to achieve a relatively hard task.
Cool.
which is getting a program.
Awesome. So for anyone watching, I would just throw there in there the caveat, understanding that I am none of those things. I'm not a medical doctor. I am not a biochemist. I'm literally what I consider to be a bro. And what I mean by that is I'm the voice of 40 years of immersion and understanding from a practical, application perspective. So if I use some language which is not correct, please feel free to go ahead and correct me. I'm still very much coming to terms with the terminology and of pharmacology and chemistry. So please feel free to correct any language mistakes that I make as we go through. So what I wanted to do basically was for me to explain some of these principles about how I approach making decisions and what I refer to as evidence-based education. Perhaps I could just kick off, again, for the audience, really more than anyone else, just explaining what I mean by evidence-based education, because people seem to be confused about this. It doesn't, to me, mean what does the clinical literature say? That's not what evidence-based education means, or evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is a process of, yes, looking at the clinical literature, yes, looking at, in our case, the sports science, but also we're very interested in 50 years of anecdote and observation from practitioners. People have spent their time under the bar. They may not necessarily, have peer-reviewed sort of research to put on the table, but they have observation, they have anecdote, they have evidence. In my opinion, what evidence-based practice means is sitting down to take the time to ask the question, look, what does the clinical evidence say? What does the body of evidence say? What do we know from 50 years of doing? And then the third leg of the triad, which I'm very passionate about, is personal choice or personal preference. We may find ourselves in a circumstance where there are a couple of alternative paths, both of which may be valid. And personal choice is every bit as important in these conversations as what does the science say, as it were. So what I would like to do in this spirit is I would like to talk about this structure of anabolic steroids having massively disparate anabolic potential. But I want to talk about each of these three areas if I can. Yeah, just touch on each of these three and invite you to have any questions. So let's talk firstly a little bit about the commercial aspects of pharmacology. I don't think it's well understood in our community that ultimately most of the anabolic steroids that are in common use in bodybuilding and in strength sports are really competitive offerings from different pharmaceutical companies to solve the same problem. Okay.
The best example would be boner pills. You got Viagra, you got Cialis, you got Levitra. You don't need all three of those. It's just that you got company A, B, and C. Company A comes up with Viagra. Everyone's buying it, billion-dollar industry. Company B is like, shit, I want some of that money. So they're going to come up with their version. But it's got to be different, though. It's either got to get a different half-life or it's got to have less of a side effect. So like, okay, Viagra makes you lose the blue-yellow neuron in your eyeball to some degree so that you lose the color blue or you lose the color yellow. I don't remember which one it was. So one of the other companies comes up with one where it doesn't fuck up your vision. And the other one's like, oh, you got to know you're getting action in an hour, otherwise Viagra doesn't work. So Cialis is like, hey, this has got a 36-hour half-life. You can get a boner anytime you want for the next day and a half, but you don't have a hard-on for the full time and have priapism and have to have a giant-ass needle drain blood out of your day. So that's why they've got these different drugs. It's not that you need to use all three of them. It's that they're just a commercial cash grab at a market. And that's so when we look base drives the industry.
Yeah. So when we look at the different classes of compounds that we use in this industry, as it were, if we want to call it that, I've spent a lot of time talking about angiotensin receptor blockers and explaining there are 8 different ARBs on offer, and that if we're going to be talking about an RAS cascade blockade, each one of these, is a somewhat similar, but also at the same time somewhat different conversation. Yeah, they're all angiotensin receptor blockers. They all were developed to fulfill a need, a clinical need, but they are subtly different. And what I don't think people understand about anabolic steroids is, just like you said, devices or products brought to market to help with erectile dysfunction, or products brought to help with angiotensin II, blockade. Anabolic steroids are a class of compound that have some things which are what we would call class specific. In other words, the entire class of compounds has that mechanism of action. Yeah. And a lot of the drugs that we see, nandrolone, and, we'll just take a couple of simple examples. So the drug primobolan is somewhat similar to the drug mastron in so much it has certain specific properties, but for some reason, people have never made the connection, but they're competitors to each other. They compete with each other in a commercial setting to fulfill a need. And what that need is fundamentally this. It's to provide a drug that brings with it the therapeutic benefits of testosterone, but at a lower level of androgenic impact, so that we can administer effectively testosterone to the androgen sensitive. And ultimately, that's what anabolic steroids are as a class of compound. They're an attempt to bring forth the therapeutic benefits of the molecule testosterone, but a lower androgenic impact. And this is the interesting thing. And then, so really how we should be viewing this is saying, okay, so we could take testosterone, or we could take one of these other drugs. They both bring somewhat similar therapeutic benefits, but they plausibly have a lower side effect profile for some of our community. And that's a fundamental difference between the way we've seen things in the past, because we've seen things in the past as saying, look, here's a drug, Anavar, and it's 600% more anabolic than testosterone. So we're going to get into the evidence in a minute that addresses that question. But just from a logical, practical point of view, it would be like saying, here's an ARB and it's 600% better than another ARB. That doesn't make any sense to begin with. It doesn't kick off the conversation with a sense of rationale and logic. If someone was to argue that if you lined up the ARBs, they have a greater or lesser sense of efficacy, I think that's a very fair thing. But there is no ARB, there is no erectile dysfunction medication, there is no, anti-diabetic medication that works 600% better than the competition. So it's kind of like when you come into this conversation, that's the first red flag. Go, well, that just doesn't make any sense that there would be a drug that does that from just right from the get-go.
So I think part of the problem is people are confusing potency with efficacy. So sure. Let's use your example of 600%. 600% is sixfold, right? Mm-hmm. So that means that 50 milligrams of Anavar, in theory, should grow 6 times the amount of muscle of 50 milligrams of testosterone. But that's not what that means. What that means is that it's got a potency. That means 50 milligrams of Anavar is supposed to be as anabolic as 300 milligrams of testosterone. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that if you saturate the system, you'll get greater efficacy with the Anavar. Yep. It just means that at lower doses, it's stronger. And that, as you pointed out in some of your Instagram things, that at a dose that we would use as an adult getting ready for a bodybuilding show, for example, that is no longer the case. Correct. That you've saturated the system, that you haven't overloaded the receptors per se, but now that there's really no differences except for the side effect profiles. Mm-hmm. And that, so in a microscopic dosing, I think we had this conversation where it was something like 1 milligram of tren was as effective as 7 milligrams of testosterone for some metric. I don't remember what it was, mm-hmm. But who the fuck's going to use 1 milligram of tren or 7 milligrams of testosterone? And we're not sheep. It was like a study on sheep or some shit. So it's completely irrelevant to the case at hand. Mm-hmm. What you need to be testing is you have a 200-pound, 40-year-old bodybuilder with 10 years of experience running 4 units of GH and 10 units of insulin and 1,000 milligrams of testosterone. What is the difference between 200 milligrams of Masteron and 200 grams of Primo? Get 100 people like that together in each leg and test it. Well, you don't got 200 bodybuilders that fit that description on the whole planet. So you're never going to get clinical data that's relevant to this population, which brings up your other model, which is anecdotal and personal experience are equal legs to that 3-legged table. Clinical studies is only part of it to come up with, what do you call it, evidence-based coaching. Like, you can't do evidence-based coaching off of studies, especially when the fucking studies are paid for by the pharmaceutical companies in the first place.
So let me just expand on that a little bit, because people have asked me very specific questions. I am not for one moment going to suggest that there are not studies that present an interesting conversation of what I would call technically correct. Yeah. And what I mean by that is the drug Ment. Most people would be familiar with the drug Ment. Ment has a reputation in bodybuilding circles of being 10 times more anabolic than testosterone. Now, this must have come from somewhere. There must be a point of origin for this statement. And as you correctly said, there is indeed a study in surrogates, not in human beings, in surrogates. In this case, the surrogates happen to be monkeys, where at very, very, very low doses, Ment is significantly more efficacious than testosterone is. That evidence does exist. But if you read the study, what happens is, as you raise the dose, the disparity between those differences becomes less and less and less, to the point whereby when we are dosing at 1 milligram per kilogram, which is, a dosage, when we extrapolate that out to human use dosages, that's somewhat approaching what we would call working doses for performance enhancing drugs. There is no difference. And so it's an important point to say, when it comes to steroidal SARMs and when it comes to non-steroidal SARMs, there is absolutely a case to be made at tiny, tiny doses that have no application to our tribe. There is a technical discussion to be had. But as we raise the dose, the difference between the two becomes less and less and less, until we ultimately reach a point where you're saying, well, at working doses, there is no evidence in surrogates. And we'll move across, as we said, to anecdote and observation either. And a classic example would be, there's an entire tribe out there saying Ment is 10 times more anabolic than testosterone, but in dozens of years, in decades of exposure, if that was true, every professional bodybuilder, every aspiring bodybuilder would be leaning into those drugs to a greater degree than the drugs that have a reputation of having less anabolic potential. And the interesting thing is, even though it's never been structured, even though it's never been set out in an intended way, I think it's fair to say over the years, we've had enough separation of drug behaviors into the Nandrolone-only tribe and the people that use Ment versus those that don't, the people that swear by Trenbolone versus that don't, that in a very ad hoc sense, we have actually been running blind trials to this degree. And what I mean by that is, you can go to any high-level bodybuilding show in the country or the world even, and look at the competitors, and you can't tell by looking at them what their drug protocol is, but you should be able to logically.
Well, the irony is, none of them used Ment.
I agree.
I've never met a pro bodybuilder. I don't think I've ever met an amateur bodybuilder who used Ment.
I 100% agree. I would go one step further and say, look, when it comes to nutritional models, when it comes to training models, and when it comes to drug models, for all intents purposes, if we were to take away the outliers, there are always going to be, that guy that happens to do this. But if we look at let's just clip off the outliers and look at the middle. For all intents and purposes, everybody's fundamentally been doing the same thing for the last 30 years.
I tried the Nandrolones only thing from 2018 until 2021. And it worked just as well for me as I did with Test. And then in 2021, I went back to your Test and Primo model, which I got secondhand from John Jewett, not knowing it was originally your model. And it's been working fine. I don't see a significant difference one way or the other between Nandrolones only or Test and Primo, except, we could get into the weeds and we can discuss it. And you and me can parse out exactly what I'm experiencing versus why it is, because I have some questions for you we can get to afterward. But for the most part, I was the only bodybuilder I've ever met who's done Nandrolone only. I was the only one who tried it I've ever met.
So just so I'm clear for anyone listening, I have done Nandrolone only, just out of curiosity. It works great. What I would argue, though, is all of these different models, in incredibly simple terms, they work. Yeah. So this is not a conversation about that works and that doesn't work. I've never made that argument. What I've made the argument to say is, look, if we're in this game for the next 20 years, if that's our goal, and there are a half a dozen models that potentially, quote unquote, work that are options, does it not make sense then to lean in to either one or two things, either the most benign of those choices based on what we know about the application of these drugs? And this is my argument. In other words, if you view this to say, look, all anabolic steroids accrete protein tissue, something as mundane as accretion of protein tissue at approximately the same rate, then it's what else they do that determines which drug, when, why, and how much. So I'm not saying there isn't a case for other anabolic steroids, not the most benign, but if all you want to say, look, I'm very happy with my lot, I would like to put on another 20 pounds of tissue. If that's all you want, something as benign as that, I just want to be 20 pounds, better off in terms of tissue mass, then why would we not always, in the first instance, lean into the most benign of those? So removing testosterone would not be considered to be the most benign of those choices, nor would leaning into not approved for human use variants of one of the anabolic steroids, because we just simply don't have enough clinical evidence to support its safety profile. Nor would be leaning into, I think the simplest thing would be saying, look, I think we should have a testosterone base, and then there's 3 or 4 candidates which we could say, look, they have the same potential as each other. They are subtly different, but these would be the starting point for the conversation for building a cycle design. And the starting point is simple as this. They all work at approximately the same rate of protein accretion. Let's begin our discussion based on the most benign of the choices. And the ones that we would remove from that in the first instance would be methylated orals. Clearly, hopefully people understand that brings with a class of problems you can avoid by simply not using methylated orals. You remove that entire class of problem. Any veterinary drugs, simply because we don't have very good human clinical data, we can put aside. Any drugs that we don't have good quality human clinical evidence on at the doses we use, and Ment would be example for that. So Ment is a drug that was at least evaluated in human use, but it was evaluated at very small doses, like 400 micrograms, 800 micrograms a day. So if we start talking about 300 milligrams a week, the dose is massively over what has been evaluated in humans. And that's not saying anything beyond, so this brings to the table questions that we cannot answer with confidence about the consequence of use. Whereas we look at a drug like Trenbolone or Nandrolone or Anavar, these are the most studied drugs in this class, and they have been deployed at significantly larger doses than even we're using. The great example that I offered many years ago was, so Trenbolone was studied in women at 1,200 milligrams a week for a whole year. That's very insightful data for us because it gives us a safety profile at a dose that I don't personally use that much myself. And anytime we can access a drug that is in human clinical use that has been evaluated in humans at more than we're using, this bodes well for a safety profile discussion.
So I was on the same page, and I had came up with the same kind of model, some of the same model idea as you prior to finding out about your models, that I never really agreed with the blast and cruise. I thought you run the amount that you can get away with and still have pristine blood work and just fucking stay there. Yep. And this is for competitive bodybuilders. This is not for the average Joe, right? And that I found that Nandrolone was the safest choice with Anavar, or if you're going to go the testosterone route, then testosterone, and then you can mitigate some of the DHT with adding in some EQ. Now, I learned from John Jewett, who had taken your class, that the EQ can be nephrotoxic, and thus it's not optimal. And the other thing I personally experienced and that I figured out on my own was it's the combination of testosterone with nandrolone that really results in gyno. If you run the nandrolone just by itself, even at 1,000, for me, even at 1,000 milligrams a week, I got no gyno. But with testosterone plus nandrolone, it was just a shit show. Now, what I didn't expect to happen is that after the Texas Pro in 21, I started on testosterone, and I was able to creep up to a 400 testosterone, even having an 84 estradiol, no gyno. I was able to add in Primo, and I got up to a 900 Primo. It crushed my estradiol all the way down to 15. Then I balanced the two things out to 700, kind of 47 estradiol, which would be optimal for the IGF-1 conversion of the GH. What I didn't expect to happen is adding in even 10 milligrams a week of nandrolone started causing gyno, the worst I've ever had in my life. So I think that between the three drugs, like you said, is having a hormone replacement therapy dose of testosterone, and then relying on Anavar for your DHT class and nandrolone for your nandrolone class are the three safest drugs. However, for injectable, Primo makes more sense than Anavar because, as you mentioned, the methylation can be liver toxic. I noticed that on one of your models, you did something I do also, which is oral Anavar pre-workout as kind of like a pre-workout assistance. And I noticed you have on one of your more aggressive models, Anadrol instead of Anavar as a pre-workout. Can you, do you mind explaining to me why you chose Anadrol over Anavar rather than just doubling the dose of Anavar?
So what I would argue is, for people that are not familiar with my models, I've tried to introduce something I call basal use. And now the intention of basal use is allowing us to enjoy the enhanced life without really being concerned about anything too much. The anecdote I like to use is to be able to sit with your medical doctor and explain what you've been doing for 5 years. And he says, look, I don't like what you're doing, but I can't tell you why I don't like what you're doing. I just don't like what you're doing. Whereas there is a model that would say, look, if you keep pressing the boundaries, you're going to get to the point where I'm going to get up from your side of the desk. I'm going to stand with the doctor and start waving my finger at you saying this isn't going to end well. Yeah. So what I would argue is that for most people, basal use, 95% of people in our community, basal use is really all they ever need. But there is, it's fair to say, going to be a smaller group of people, the people that are competing in powerlifting and strength sports, in bodybuilding, that there is an argument for what I call situational use. In other words, sometimes we do these things over here, but we do them sometimes because we're trying to, elicit the outcomes from them. Yeah. Now, I just want to roll back a bit and then I'll answer your question. So what I would argue is this is where the third leg of that triad comes in, which is personal choice. I encourage people at first exposure to spend some time with testosterone and Anavar, testosterone and Primobolan, testosterone and Mastron, and testosterone with nandrolone, so they can speak from a personal experience point of view. Because if you spend enough time with people, you'll find people that have preferences. They prefer this versus that. They prefer but all of these are valid choices in terms of the relative risk profile between Primobolan, Mastron, nandrolone, and Anavar has to be described as the least benign of the choices that we could make. We're making bad choices, but we're trying to make the best choices we can, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I would argue you should try them so you can speak with personal experience to, do they speak to you? I'm a good example. I don't like Anavar. It just doesn't talk to me. That doesn't mean it's not a valid drug. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means it's never talked to me. Mastron is my preference from those four. Now, when I want to then go up from there, typically I have an escalation profile that leads me into situational use. So I have testosterone and Mastron or testosterone and Primobolan. I very rarely go into Anavar because it just, for some reason, it just doesn't speak to me. Yeah. And I think it's important that people have the opportunity to say things like that. That's just my experience. Yeah. Now, what I would argue then is if we start leaning into other drugs to add to that combination of Mastron and something, a DHT derivative, then realistically, the two classes of drugs that we might bring to the table would be potent steroidal progestins. Of an example would be Trenbolone or methylated orals. Okay. So the thing about Anadrol, anyone that's been into powerlifting or power building or strength sports will generally be able to say, look, there's a class of drugs like Superdrol and Halotestin and, Anadrol as an example. They work very well. You seem to create outcomes in force production that you don't get from the more benign drugs like Nandrolone and Primobolan. I think that's very fair. Yeah. The challenge, of course, becomes one of sustainability. So in other words, I'm not saying we don't use those drugs like Superdrol and Halotestin, but what I was saying is for the great majority of them, they're not required. So it becomes an additional risk profile that you sign up for. Say, I'm happy with that. I'll take that on. Yep. And then secondarily, it's a case of, well, if we're going to use them, what makes sense is we use them strategically and we position them as in we use them to get a job done and then we get out. Now, what I would argue is the models that you're referencing are what I call recomposition models, body recomp. Now, if you listen to the videos I make on that, I'm pretty clear on this. I think body recomposition is the stupidest thing ever. Like it's okay. As bad as cutting cycles. So I'm not recommending them, but I do make content for people because they want to know what I would do if I was going to do it. And what I mean by that is I personally think that, look, if you're going to wash off body fat, you should leverage the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is caloric restriction. Okay. Right. And if you're going to attempt to grow tissue mass, you should leverage the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is caloric intake. Yeah. So
which is why recomp's stupid, because you're not getting your two greatest tools.
You're literally using the drugs to do the work.
Right.
You're trying to hold your calories at maintenance levels, right? And use the drugs. What I would argue is that you open this door or you open that door. And the moment you open that door, then this conversation becomes somewhat mute. But to answer your question, I think it is fair to say that, and this is as much observational as it is clinically based, drugs like Anadrol tend to have a greater impact on force production than drugs like Primobolan. I think that's fair.
Okay. So I guess where I was going with this question is, I see Anadrol as kind of like the primitive version of Superdrol. Since Superdrol doesn't cause the subcutaneous water retention, both of them have the inhibition of the particular enzyme that causes water retention intracellular. But Superdrol does not cause the water retention extracellular. At least that's how I understand it. So the Superdrol has the best of both worlds. You get all the strength benefits of the Anadrol without any of the hypothetical blood pressure increases from the water retention of the Anadrol. I figured you might not agree with that.
I don't necessarily agree with that. And the reason I say that is I would argue that Halotestin, Superdrol, and Anadrol is a discussion we're going to have about the next 4 weeks of your life. Right? Now, even if we saw a 10-point increase in blood pressure for 30 days, yeah,
and it's relevant.
Really, I mean, come on, in the scheme of things, blood pressure is a killer over time. It's raising up 10 points. If you were 140/80 at basal level and you went into a push phase and you went to 150/90, I understand there's people out there that are going to flip out of that, but I'm saying, but even if that was the consequence of your actions and you did it for 30 days and then you stepped back and you went back to an acceptable profile, when it washes out and we're starting to talk about risk profile here, you're saying, look, this is a business with risk. There is no model here with no risk. And I would argue that is the least of your problems. The greatest problem our community faces is guys that are walking around at hypertensive conditions for years at a time and completely oblivious to it.
Well, that leads to my next question. That in the same model, you escalated the telmisartan from 40 to 80.
Correct.
I guess I immediately assumed that the reason you escalated the telmisartan was to compensate from the transition from the Anavar to the Anadrol to account for the increased blood pressure of the Anadrol. Is that basically where you're going with that?
I guess I'm you opened the conversation. We're talking a little bit about the way Western medicine works today. Whether it's true, whether it's not, this is my opinion. In my opinion, Western medicine is still treating symptoms, they're not proactively getting in front of problems. Now,
Band-Aids.
Yeah. So anyone that came to me and said, look, I'm moving from the basal model to a situational use model for this purpose one of the things that we do in the prediction of the escalation of problems is elevate our mitigation strategy by default, rather than waiting for it to come along. We say, okay, so we're going to put a little bit more antioxidant strategy on the table. Maybe we'll put a little bit more insulin resistance strategy on the table. Maybe we'll elevate our angiotensin receptor blocker strategy from this dose to that dose, predicting it, understanding that we're going to do it for a block of time, and then we'll pull back from the edge when we're dialing ourselves back to basal use. Now, what I would argue though is it specifically anadrol as a class of drug? No, I would just basically say, look, typically what happens when people move from basal use to situational use, the testosterone goes up, the DHT base, let's say we're using primobolan, goes up, in comes the anadrol, in comes 100 milligrams of tren. The entire androgenic load has escalated. And so the consequential side effect profile would expect to be elevated as a consequence of the sum total of all our actions as opposed to a single specific drug. Now, if it's the experience of an individual that says, look, I use 50 milligrams of anadrol and I go from being normotensive to uncontrolled hypertensive, I have no problem in the world with that, but I wouldn't set a framework around that. The framework is set around your escalating total androgen load. Let's escalate mitigation strategy with it.
So what I noticed was there were 3 basic prophylactic agents that escalated with the gear. And I just wanted to make sure that I understood that the escalation is in compensation for the side effects. For example,
Sure.
The metformin goes up, the talmosartan goes up, and then insulin is introduced. And I assume that the reason why the insulin is introduced is because it's assumed the blood glucose goes up. That's why the metformin is escalated, that there's no additional benefit of the metformin. There's no additional benefit of the insulin, except for mitigating the insulin resistance from the increased body fat and increased GH. Likewise, there's no reason to increase the talmosartan if your blood pressure does not go up. For example,
that would depend, in my opinion, upon how you view these drugs. And I do understand that what I'm about to say may be controversial. I have no problem with that. But what I would argue is I've chosen those agents for very specific purposes. A simple example would be I lean preferentially into telmisartan as an ARB because of what telmisartan brings to the table. It helps us with our lipid profile. It helps us with insulin sensitivity. You could argument, I do accept the fact that the evidence is hardly ironclad, but you could argue that ARBs by definition are myostatin inhibitors. There is some evidence, unfortunately it only exists in women, we don't have it in men, right, that supports the idea that an ARB is in fact a myostatin inhibitor. So when you look at my myostatin inhibition model, growth hormone is considered, at least on paper, a myostatin inhibitor. Yeah, an ARB is considered a myostatin inhibitor. Injectable L-carnitine is considered a myostatin inhibitor. Now, the question would be, to what clinical effect? That's a fair question, and we don't have the answer to that information. But what I would argue, in my experience at least, is that when you stack all of these things on top of each other, that there is enough of an effect to then add that one more checkbox. It's not saying like that's the reason we're taking them, but it's not like a negative. You would say, look, in the first place, we're taking these drugs for these reasons. But I do want to bolt underneath that all of these drugs have the potential, at least if you wanted to pull that thread, to say, but they're performance enhancing drugs in their own right.
So the reason why I bring it up is, for example, because I am working on a basic one of your models that my blood pressure was 120 over 69. So I think, and that's on 40 telmisartan, despite the 1500 gear load, that my blood glucose in the morning when hydrated after a full night's sleep, not partial sleep, is 81. And that's using just 500 milligrams of metformin, despite being on 6 units of GH. So to me, I didn't see any direct reason to increase my telmisartan or metformin, but it is on your model. And so I wanted to get your opinion about that. Likewise, because my blood glucose is 81, I have not used my Humalog or my long-acting insulin, which I have right in my freezer in my bedroom.
Can I ask you
Yeah.
what is your daily caloric intake at this point?
4,600.
Okay, that's very good. So I don't know what your personal observation experience is, but you would be considered to be not a massive outlier, but most guys, as they are approaching 5,000 calories a day,
at 43 years old, at 225 pounds, at 5'4", I should be dead, let alone have a 0 calcium score, have perfect blood pressure, perfect blood sugar. I just figured that I didn't need these rescue agents more than I'm already taking because I'm at the picture of health.
Sure.
But you likewise, the other thing that was kind of concerning to me was the trend factor is a very low dose you prescribe. You basically have it at 200 or less, but you want to work on the.
I would say 100. I would say 100. 100.
Okay, but it's on the glucocorticoid receptor as an antagonist, right? So I guess my question is it a reverse agonist? Because there shouldn't need to be any antagonism because there wouldn't be any cortisol because I'm in a calorie surplus. But if it's a reverse agonist, like how tamoxifen is a reverse agonist on the ERA receptor on the breast, then the glucocorticoid receptor could actually drive animalism from tren. But then that also brings up the concern that it binding to the brain glucocorticoid receptor at as low a dose as I think it's 10 milligrams a day can cause brain damage. So that's why I hadn't.
Where did you get that number from? 10 milligrams a day.
John Jewett has it in his Nandrolone lecture. Okay. It's at 70 milligrams a week is where the brain damage was tracked, but 35 milligrams a week is where the anti-catabolic effect is.
Okay, so let me throw out a few frameworks because, I mean, I have a world of respect for John. I think he brings his own flavors and his experience to that. But that what you're saying is a little bit different to the framework. Let me just explain the framework that I use. Where you said before, for example, where boldenone was considered to be, deleterious to our kidneys. What I would argue is this: you should view all anabolic steroids as deleterious to our renal health. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that what we need to be clear on, though, is as we raise the total load, our risk profile for kidney health grows. It doesn't matter what you're using. But there is some evidence that would suggest, look, there appears to be, based on what we have available to us today, a difference between the different steroids in terms of their nephrotoxicity or their cognitive toxicity. Right. So what I would argue is this, and that is, in a general sense, DHT derivatives seem to be the most benign choice or class of drugs after testosterone. So if we say, okay, we have testosterone as a base, too little testosterone, a hypergonadal state would be, say, deleterious to our health. But as we escalate the dose, we move through an inverted J curve that goes, well, this is positive, and this is then more and more and becomes deleterious again. So what I would say is, whether we're talking about renal health or whether we're talking about cognitive health, all of these compounds should be viewed through the filter of saying, not ideal, but some of them, it appears to be, based on the relatively limited data we have today, that stand out to say, look, that appears to be worse than that. It's a choice of bad choices, if that makes sense. Yeah. Right. So what I would argue is this, and that is potent steroidal progestins, and I would classify that as Trenbolone and Ment, right? Of the commonly used anabolic substances would appear to be less ideal to our mental health than other drugs. And that seems to be borne out in observational practice, because most guys, as they escalate the tren dose, when you talk to them about side effects, most of the time it's what's in their head. They have trouble with sleep hygiene. They have trouble with erectile dysfunction. They have trouble with aggression sometimes. These are issues you don't really hear issues, that you would relate to. You'd say, look, there seems to be a bias here towards cognitive function. Yeah. So what I would argue is, well, that doesn't mean that we never use those drugs, but we should approach them with a little more caution than some of the drugs that we know to be a little less benign. So if there's a study and it lines up 4 different anabolic steroids in common use, and it says, look, testosterone seems to be the most benign and then Winstrol, and then Nandrolone, and then Trenbolone is the worst. I mean, you kind of got to either lean into that study or you don't lean into. I have no problem if someone wants to look at the evidence that we hold today that looks at the profiling of these drugs and says, look, it's not ironclad, your drugs. So I have no problem with that. So what I would be arguing here is it's not a case of don't use Trenbolone, but use it sparingly. And then, so you'd say, well, so when would you use it? I would only use it under the circumstances where you're in a hard caloric deficit, which would.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get at. It's not it's not a glucocorticoid reverse agonist.
Correct.
It's an antagonist.
It's flipping the switch on that script saying, look, if you're in a caloric deficit, okay, that drug is less likely to be significantly impactful than if you're in a hard caloric deficit. Less likely to be.
It also has the TBG effect, which drives up T3, I believe, and it's got an uncoupler effect. So if your problem is you can't grow because you can't eat enough food, Tren would be a terrible choice. Tren is a great choice if you're trying to burn fat and preserve muscle while you're doing it.
I would argue,
a true statement?
I would argue for competitors, okay, Trenbolone is a drug that's probably going to come on the table. I think that's fair. And I think we should place it on the table when we're competing. Right. In other words, if you're taking 2023, if you're taking a year off to grow tissue, Trenbolone's not in that package for me. But
I wanted to hear.
But if you're trying to get your pro card in 23, we're probably going to be using Trenbolone.
The reason why I say that is because your model was the only model I saw that was a growth model that had Tren on it. And it was, I thought, ticking the glucocorticoid box. And it seemed to be in an anabolic sense, not in an anti-catabolic sense. And I would just, for the record, so these people think I'm not judgmental here, I used 1,400 milligrams of Tren and one show per week. Like, it's not that I'm opposed to Tren.
How did you tolerate that?
See, like, I'm kind of a hermit to begin with. So my experience with Tren is I can get sleep disturbance for the 10 milligrams. I start to not have any anger issues up until about 50 milligrams a day. Once I cross the 50 milligram a day threshold, I don't notice anything till 100 milligrams a day. When I go over 100 milligrams a day, I start feeling like I'm sick, like I have the flu all the time, and working myself up to 200 milligrams a day. I think for that show, I was at 200 milligrams a day of Tren, 1 milligram a day of dimethyltren, 100 milligrams a day of Mastron, 100 milligrams a day of Winstrol. So as you can see, like, my daily dose was higher than my weekly dose should be. That's absolutely asinine to run that much fucking gear to preserve tissue. But in the state of mind you're in when you're on that much Tren, it seems perfectly reasonable.
No.
So that's why having a coach would be a good idea, because he'd be like, motherfucker, you're crazy. What are you doing?
I understand. So let me just make it doesn't need to be the closing statement, but I want to get this in. You made a comment about specific dosages. I would caution people that what I would argue is I don't feel that we have the evidence today to be quoting dosages. Where my 100 milligrams comes from, just so people can understand, I would argue this, and that is, if we take my strategy and say, look, I'm really not saying that what we did historically didn't work. Only a fool would try to argue that. Like, we had fabulous bodybuilders before I ever opened my mouth. What I'm trying to do is remove unnecessary risk. That's ultimately what I'm trying to do. Not all risk, because my audience doesn't need no risk models. I don't need no risk models. The most dangerous thing that I do in my life is I ride a motorcycle in Thailand. It's nuts, right? Like the risk profile from going out for a blast on my bike.
Jungle.
Yeah. No, well, I even do it on the roads. The difference, like a 30-minute ride, down the road on my big cruiser this afternoon, is exponentially more risk than anything that I do when I come home with pharmacology. It's like much higher risk profile. Yeah. So I don't need no risk, but at the same time, I don't want to take on risk if it's not necessary. That doesn't fit my thinking model. Yeah. So what I would caution people to say is, look, I don't feel that we're at the point yet we can start recommending dosages beyond this. And that was what I would say is, look, if someone said to you there has to be a difference between these drugs that are in lifetime human clinical use, growth hormone, insulin, testosterone are some of the most studied drugs in all pharmacology. We know a great deal about these drugs, perhaps not everything, but they are some of the most studied drugs in the world. Yeah. So when you consider the risk profile of that versus a drug like, say, YK11, which has never even been tested in a rat, we're having two different conversations here. Yeah. In the same way, when it comes to dosages, what I would argue is, look, if we have millions of men today living on 200 milligrams of testosterone, right or wrong, under the guise of testosterone replacement therapy, surely there has to be a margin for those that accept some risk to say, look, I can get away with this much. Let's just argumentatively say it's 2x, right? Now, that number is made up. It's a fictitious number. But what I would argue is, like, so if we took the clinical dose for all of these drugs and at maximum said, I'm going to use 50% more than they use clinically, I would consider that to be an extremely low risk model. It's not no risk, but it's low risk. But the point I'm making is, but those numbers are arbitrary numbers that I'm fabricating. There's no evidence to support those numbers. They're based on, we have studies using testosterone up to 600 milligrams a week. We have studies using nandrolone up to 600 milligrams a week. So somewhere between 200 milligrams a week and 600 milligrams a week, you can basically throw a dart and say, look, provided when you execute this, you are diligent and you're looking, like almost as a hypochondriac for adverse effects. And when you see an adverse effect, you don't ignore it, you respond. What I'm saying is, I feel that we can have a discussion, a grown-up discussion about risk profile, but I don't want people to start thinking, you can use 70 milligrams a week and it's safe, and you use 100 milligrams a week and it's not. I don't want to put that message out there because that, in my opinion, that data doesn't exist.
And I know that I'm one of those people that likes to use numbers because I'm just a numbers guy.
Sure.
And I'm quoting my personal use numbers.
Sure.
And I'm also going by what studies have shown. And I look at the numbers that are like a ballpark figure on your thing. Of course, everyone's different genetic variability. Obviously, I can handle way more gear than the normal person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
you seem to be You seem to be highly tolerant. Yes.
So I mean, I don't respond well to it, but it doesn't hurt me either. So one of those things.
Can we talk about that just momentarily? Because this is another message I'm trying to get out there. What a lot of people don't understand is that a lot of the individuals that have very high profiles in our industry are hyper responders. They just are. There's no getting around it. Yeah. So unfortunately, you give them you give them the same food as you're eating, you give them the same training regime as you're eating, and you give them the same drugs. They just respond differently. They have a different genetic profile. And what that means very often is they have more problems with the same dose, and they get a greater hypertrophic response. You are somewhat like me. I would suggest you're an extreme version of me. I'm a draft horse. You can give me the drugs. I don't get a fabulous response. They work. I'm not saying they don't work, right? But I just get a very ordinary, average response. But I also suck up the side effects. I don't get acne. I don't get erectile dysfunction. I don't get this. I don't get that. My blood work is always looking good. And what I would caution people to understand is that both the hypertrophic response from these agents and the adverse effects profile is highly variable. And they're also welded together, as you say. So sometimes people come to me and they complain about the problems they're having, but I always see that as potentially, let's just start the conversation. That might actually be a good thing because you can get away with the lower dose. So in other words, when people talk about, like we had this history of saying, look, everyone starts with 600 milligrams of test, right? Now, I understand where it began with, but what I would argue is, look, the degree of intra-individual response that we see is so vast with people that realistically, we should start closer to the clinical dose, right? And slowly titrate the dose, looking for how you respond as an individual, because there is a chance that you'll be like Todd, or there's a chance you'll be like Victor and you get an ordinary response and you'll get very few concepts. But there is also a chance. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I started on 5 milligrams a day.
Yeah.
After 12 years, I'd mapped out my receptors to know I could get away with 200 a day. Mm-hmm. Total gear load, basically 1,400 milligrams. But I didn't. It took me a solid 10 years before I ever crested the 1,000 mark. Now, knowing now what I knew then, I could have started at that to begin with.
Sure.
But it took 10 years of pussyfooting around to find a dangerous dose for me, which I didn't hit until I was 40 years old.
Yep.
Now, I know guys starting at 500 milligrams, and boom, their back's covered in back knee.
Yeah.
They're pockmarked like Swiss cheese. They look like a leper.
Yep. And this is
and they
one
out
of
their receptors. So now, like, they need a huge load in order to be able to feel anything ever again.
And this is one of the things that I don't feel is well understood in our community, which says, look, response is highly variable, good and bad. And so there's only one way to approach it, and that is not with a blanket model, one size fits all. You start with this dose. In other words, you start and then you gradually titrate, and you're seeking how you as an individual respond to these things. And I think two things happen there. One is very often extremely elite athletes don't understand the struggle of the day-to-day man. And at the same time, people will hear dosages that some individuals are taking, and you go, yeah, but I mean, I don't have any problems. Like, I'm very honest. I respond best at about 1,500 milligrams a week total androgen load. Yeah. And at that dose, I really don't have too many problems to deal with, but I also considerate enough to say I don't intend to live there. I flirt there, and people say that's quite a lot of drugs. And I would say, well, I don't really have a problem with that statement, but you have to understand when you say quite a lot, you need to understand that response is so highly variable that is really only a statement that you can make on a case-by-case basis. There is extreme, and you kind of described what you're talking about with the Trenbolone before, but if someone said, look, I've taken Victor's models and I've halved them again, if it works, I have no problem. If someone's taken Victor's models and I've added 25% to that again because I feel that that's what I need and I understand the risk profile, that's fine. I'm not trying to paint people into a box. All I'm trying to do is get people to accept that a great deal of what we premised our performance-enhancing drug planning ideas on in the past was simply manufactured. It was made-up information. It wasn't based on observation and experience, and it wasn't based on clinical literature. It was just crazy dudes saying crazy things and people thinking, well, that must be correct because I read it on the internet.
So a couple of questions for you while we're on this topic of side effects. So I had this hypothesis that bleeding people like it was ancient Rome to get the blood out of them on the off chance that the fact that they had higher hematocrit levels was kind of premature, that the extra red blood cells are carrying capacity for oxygen molecules to allow you to work out better, and that just because your blood's slightly thicker doesn't mean you're going to stroke out and die, and that people were jumping the gun on that. And you were the first person I'd ever seen to actually be on my side of the fence and not do prophylactic bleedings called phlebotomy, but to say, and you actually went into that the studies on polycythemia vera were this, and the study on erythrocytemia was this, and it was a very interesting podcast. I want to make sure that I was correct in understanding that what you're saying is if you have no other risk factors for stroke or cardiovascular disease whatsoever, having a 55 or a 56% hemoglobin or a 17 hematocrit is not a death sentence, and that bleeding them isn't the necessary step.
I guess there's 3 or 4 key points. That one is leaving the stimulus in place, which is creating the excess of hematocrit, and at the same time removing the hematocrit. That doesn't make any sense. If you're going to perform a clinical phlebotomy, logic says you remove the stimulus and then you perform the procedure. I support that idea, but putting a stimulus in place that has a known outcome of elevation of hematocrit and then trying to draw blood out it's folly. It's going to be days before it's back. Like, these drugs cause an elevation of hematocrit. So the model of phlebotomy and leaving a clinical, there's a difference. Let me explain. There's a difference between someone that was undergoing testosterone replacement therapy and a discussion about clinical phlebotomy and someone who's using bolus doses of androgens. If you're using bolus doses of androgens, although the curve is not linear, there is a dose escalation curve. The more you take, the higher your hematocrit becomes. up until a point where it flattens off. Now, what I would argue here is there is some evidence in testosterone replacement therapy cohorts that says hematocrit levels over this number may plausibly be, correlated to these adverse effects. But the problem is that, but that's not healthy young men. Right. They're plausibly individuals that already have a pre-existing health condition, and then you exacerbate it with that circumstance. So what I would say is, all I'm really trying to have in that regard is a factual, honest conversation that says, look, this is what the evidence actually says. Yeah. And at the same time, understand this, and that is, well, the easiest solution is to implement an ARB like losartan or telmisartan or one of the other sartans, understanding that one of the consequences of the use of those drugs is the risk of anemia. In other words, we produce less red blood cells when we're taking those things. And the irony being is, in the general community, you might see that as a risk profile, but for our tribe, it's a plausible benefit because everybody has elevated hematocrit levels. Right. And the moment you find someone that's walking around at 56% and you give them an ARB and you wait for 90 days, of course, the caveat being you have to wait long enough for the clearance process, then you go back and you look, and all of a sudden these people have, what I consider to be clinically accepted, hematocrit profiles. So it's one of these many benefits of using an angiotensin receptor blocker is it simply eliminates the need to do clinical phlebotomy.
Right, like the individual who has high HbG, has thick blood, also has clogged arteries, is also 70 years old, also has hypertension, is also on 10 different medications, and already has a history of cardiovascular disease or stroke. And that's why he's prone to these clots. And I always thought that if I am at 0 and at 51, and I go to 300 tests and I'm at 54, and I'm at 1500 gear load and I'm at 55, that 55 ain't going to kill me. It's not the gear that's doing it. I just have thick blood because I train hard. It's like the vascularity. Like, you may not see it right now, but I'm known for being particularly vascular. Yeah. It's either because I have asthma, so I need more red blood cells to carry oxygen, or I train that fucking hard that I need to have a good reservoir of oxygen to go into training.
Are you currently using an ARB as part of your regime?
Yeah, I use 40 milligrams of
you said that before. Sorry. Have you? How long have you been doing that for? And when was the last time you had a hematocrit reading?
Last hematocrit reading, I think, was July. It was about 55, 54. Okay. And I'd been using the telmisartan for a year.
Okay, cool. I would argue that, again, my clients don't need no risk. Like there's, if you speak to various bodies that control these things, the Endocrine Society, et cetera, there are actually 3 or 4 different recommendations. The recommendation of 53%, I think most people can settle on that. So it says 53%, and you're using, as you said, 1,500 milligrams a week of androgens, and you're at 54. I'm not going to argue statistically there is no risk. That's not what I'm here to do. But what I'm arguing is so what are you going to do about it? Do a phlebotomy and pull it down to 48, and 3 days later it's back? Like how does that solve the problem?
I mean, it's also my blood is expensive. It's got GH in it. It's got androgens in it. I'm going to go give them blood. Are they going to pay me for that blood? Because I have to go replace the gear they just took out of me. That doesn't make any sense. Money doesn't grow on trees, neither does gear. So, I mean, that's some pretty fucking amazing blood. Can I keep that blood and I can put it back in me later when I need it? What if I want to do a powerlifting meet one day? I've got all this fucking blood with some gear in it. Now it's worth it. I could sell that blood to people and they could get as strong as me. I could market it. If Chris Helmsworth can push that bullshit training system of his, be like, oh, you could get Thor's body. It's like, hey, you could get Todd Lee's body. Just drink his blood or inject his blood. I want that.
Cool. So did we cover that subject of hematocrit? It's just, in my opinion,
for sure.
I'm not opposed to clinical phlebotomy, but leaving the stimulus in place and performing a phlebotomy doesn't make any sense.
It's very Western medicine of them. Very Western medicine is to put a Band-Aid on an arm that's been already cut off.
Yeah.
So
let's do this. Let's just cycle back. We've been talking for almost an hour now. Let's just cycle back. I just want to make sure, because I'm going to direct people to this conversation when they're asking about this discussion about the difference between potency for anabolic. So I just want to recap that if I can, yeah, because we didn't talk about nothing. So the first thing is I ask people to understand this, and that is anabolic steroids, for the most part, are different pharmaceutical companies offering to say this to solve the same problem in the community, which is, how do we deliver the therapeutic benefits of testosterone at lower androgenic impact in the androgen sensitive? And what that means is that you have a number of choices that you could, for all purposes, see as competitive to each other. I consider Masteron, Primobolan, Anavar, and Nandrolone to be drugs that you should try on a one-on-one basis for 3 months, and try the next one for 3 months, and try, so you can speak on a personal level to whether it speaks to you or not. And it is my opinion and my experience that when people go through a block of time where they spend 3 months with Anavar, and understanding a testosterone base plus some Anavar, a testosterone base plus some Masteron, usually at the end of that, people will be able to rank those 4 drugs in an order of preference. Very rarely does someone say they're all the same. Yeah. So that
actually, I want to address that with the Masteron and the Primo, right? So I know one of your pet peeves is people think that Masteron causes hair loss.
Mm-hmm.
I have noticed that when I add Masteron in, I lose hair.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I always save Masteron for 10 days out.
Mm-hmm.
So is it because the T3 is up? Is it because Winstrol was added? There is a myriad of other factors that goes into increased total body stress.
Can I try and answer that question? Because this is one of the things that people need to understand. When you expose yourself to a drug like Masteron, the other conditions of which you are subjected to matter. Yeah. And what I would argue is this. So there is androgenic or anadrenic, however you want to pronounce it, alopecia, which is basically, I consider it a disease state, which we would define as the miniaturization of hair follicles, such that the hairs that the hair follicle itself produces become so weak over a succession of life cycles that they can no longer break through the skin to the scalp. And effectively what you see is a reduction in hair follicle density. The difference is that the time frame involved in that disease state is, we're talking about many years, from a perfectly healthy hair follicle to one so weakened that it can no longer produce a healthy hair that can break through the epidermis. That time frame is not 10 days, it's 5 years. Yeah. And then there's something we would call a hair shedding event. And hair shedding events happen relatively acutely. But you have to understand, so androgenic alopecia and hair shedding are 2 very different things that people put together. Now, what I would argue is this: a hair shedding event is something that we can talk about as a consequence of, I did this and I saw that. That's great. But that's not androgenic alopecia. If you want to have a conversation about, I'm experiencing male pattern baldness, right? Then you have to have a conversation that dates back to what have you been doing for the last 5 years? Because that's not a 2-week discussion. There's no clinical evidence to support the idea that androgenic alopecia happens in 2 weeks. Something acute is a different discussion. Now, if you said, okay, so I'm in a pre-contest state is the only time I use Masteron, and some people will say this, they'll agree, yeah, well, it is the only time I use Masteron, right? And I'm under, high caloric, so high caloric reduction and the stresses and all that sort of stuff. And then I got to this point and I noticed hair shedding. You think, what the fuck could that be? Unfortunately, Masteron has such a reputation that you immediately point the finger and say it must be the Masteron, right? But what I would argue is it's the sum total of all of your behaviors that has triggered that event, but you're correlating Masteron to it because it's bro law to do that. Yeah.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah. Well, that's what leads us to these observations. And this is one of the reasons that what I would suggest to people is we need to have some observation experience and we need to have some clinical evidence here, because if people cannot accept that androgenic alopecia and hair shedding are 2 distinct events, we need to discuss them separately, then we can't have a conversation. We have to have that separation. And then if you have a separation of event, you need to basically say, well, the only way you could do that would be to basically say, look, I'm in a completely no stress environment. And I make the observation that when I did that, I saw that outcome. Fine. Then all I would argue is, well, then why don't you use Primobolan? Why don't you use Anavar? Why don't you use Nandrolone? And this is the point of the 3 triads. There are certain individuals in this community that, in my opinion, they lean too heavily into the bro science. They lean too heavily into the science. They lean too heavily into the observation. The trick, in my opinion, is to stand in the middle. So if someone came to me and they said to me, look, I did what you said. I tried these 4 options. I believe on a personal observational basis that Primobolan agrees with me more than Masteron does, then that's the whole point of the model. My model is encouraging that process.
Well, that's what I was getting to. Like, my point was that because of that, I've leaned towards Primo, and I get excessive knots and subdermal lumps that I never got with the Masteron. Now, Masteron tends to be cheaper and easier to get than Primo.
Is that at the point of administration, or is that like remote from where you administer?
No, it's at the point of administration. Yeah.
Understood. Yeah.
And it was like different manufacturers, different bottles. My body subcutaneously just responds with burning pain to Primo. Now, I've been using it for a year anyway, right? But because I didn't want to resort to the Masteron until I talked to you. So I know that some people, like, for instance, John Jewett, use Primo and Masteron.
Yep.
And I see an enormous amount of aromatase inhibition from Primo. Now, I would assume that since Masteron has a reputation for more aromatase inhibition than Primo, Masteron's even worse. And that is actually an undesirable effect for me. I want to keep my estrogen high as possible to get the most out of my GH. So what is the right course of action if I'm, let's say, using 840 Primo a day, but I don't want to lose any more estrogen by introducing Masteron? You were saying people should try these things and choose the one that's right for them, but I know a lot of people use both, and that's confusing to me.
Okay, so herein we lie in the difficult ground between what I'm actually trying to do is propose a framework that fits the needs of 4 million people.
Right.
Yep.
Or 4 billion.
Well, they estimate 4 million PED users in the world. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, look, here's a framework that meets the needs of the entire user community. Yeah.
Right.
But then what you really need to do is to allow some allocation for individual tolerance and individual response and individual feedback. That's the third circle. Yeah.
Right.
And so the materials that I make publicly are literally anyone that comes along that's ever used or ever going to or ever intending to use performance enhancing drugs should be able to watch those materials and get a takeaway from it. Yeah.
Right.
But then what they need to do is they need to take that takeaway and they need to execute it, and they need to diligently observe their individual response and turn the knobs. Yeah. Now, I can describe what the knobs are. They're very simple. I'll give you a simple example. If you were to say, look, I'm taking 500 milligrams of testosterone, and I introduce another compound that has the potential to act as an aromatase inhibitor, right? And at some point, what I notice is my estradiol levels drop down. Then the obvious answer, I know it's really fucking obvious, is, well, when that becomes problematic for you, then you raise your testosterone dose.
Right. Which I did.
Because all anabolic steroids accrete protein tissue at the same rate, but it's what else they do that determines when. So if we're taking X amount of testosterone and we're happy with our estrogen and DHT profile and all of the other profiles, but we introduce another agent that then disrupts that model, let's just say it lowers that estrogen model, then the obvious response would be, just like you're flavoring a cake or whatever like that, is you go, well, I have to put a little bit more. This, all I'm trying to explain to people is, but observationally, that's very individual dependent. This is not something that happens to every person that passes across my desk. In other words, what I'm saying is the aromatized pool of the amount of aromatized substrate that is available is very dependent upon the individual. Yeah. And the way we metabolize these drugs is very dependent upon the individual. So I can explain the framework that says, at this amount of testosterone, if you're happy and you bring another drug in that disrupts that profile, then you raise the testosterone. Why? Because we want more estrogen. It's really simple to do that. But when people want a finite number of steps, do this, do this, do this, honestly, this becomes what I call coaching. You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
well, I guess where I was going with this is what is the difference between the Primo and the Masteron, except for that they're made by competing brands? Is it a rumor that one is more hair toxic? And is it a rumor that one is more aromatase inhibiting than the other?
Okay. So we can only answer with a degree of confidence based on the evidence that we have. That's the reality, right? Yeah. So what do we know? We know that finasteride works. The way it works is it inhibits testosterone being amplified into DHT. So if you have X amount of testosterone, it does not appear, based on everything we know, that testosterone itself is terribly deleterious to your hair health. It's the DHT that's the problem. This is why supposedly dutasteride and finasteride work. They inhibit the amplification. Right. So it's not the testosterone the problem, it's the DHT. Is that kind of clear? Point one.
Right. And then there's subtype 2 is in the hair follicles, and testosterone works on subtype 1 and 2. Right. So
for quote unquote normal people in the community, not our group, we would say that's true. And so then when we introduce a drug like, Primobolan or Masteron or Anavar or Winstrol or Anadrol, we would say, but these drugs are less androgenic than testosterone natively, and they're physically incapable of being converted to DHT, right?
Correct.
So just on a logical basis, you would say, well, if it's not possible to amplify them to DHT, taking a drug that can't be amplified DHT is somewhat akin to taking finasteride or taking dutasteride. There is no DHT. This is the logic, right?
Yeah. Well, this is the confusing part, that all the drugs you mentioned are DHT molecules. Now they're supposed to be non-androgenic, but if the substrate's that high, even if there's a low binding affinity to the hair follicle receptor, then eventually you will have an overflow effect.
100%. And this is the argument, this is the problem that people don't understand. And that is, but testosterone is, and this is held in clinical evidence, testosterone is able to overcome the consequence of being less androgenic than DHT by mass action. And what I mean by that is you throw enough androgenic load at the problem, whether there's DHT there or not, you're going to have a problem. Yeah. So what people need to consider then is not the individual drug they're placing on the table, but the entire androgenic load. And someone which is 5, 6, 10 times higher than a normal human being, right?
So, which is what makes like something like RU4886 makes sense, because it's a topical androgen receptor antagonist like flutamide, which is a systemic one that works on prostate cancer. But the concern is, and my friend Ethan wanted me to ask you, because he tried to get a hold of me and he couldn't, was how much gets systemic, and would the systemic have an effect on anabolism? And I answered his question from my opinion, but he wanted to hear it from you.
I think it's, again, we have to lend ourselves a little bit to understanding there are gaps in the clinical literature, the things that we can't say. Yeah. So
because there's nobody taking RU4886 stepping on the Olympia stage year after year, doing a DEXA scan of his muscle mass.
We don't know is the answer. So what I would argue is this, and say, look, I think it's fair to say that hair loss is not really a direct consequence of androgen load 1-to-1. What I mean by that is, just observationally, if elevating androgens consequentially cause aggressive hair loss, every single bodybuilder on the planet would be bald as an egg. And they're not. We have a percentage of people not terribly dissimilar to the general population that seem to suffer hair loss. If you consider most men over 40 years old, most men approaching my age, 50 years old, 50% of them will have experienced some degree of hair loss anyway. Now, I would argue if you walk around and look at masters class bodybuilders, it's not like all of them are bald. So again, this is where we need to blend these three circles. Observationally, do we see higher levels of male pattern baldness in androgen using bodybuilders and other performance athletes than we do in the general population. I would argue not really, maybe, but not really. Yeah. And so what this lends itself to is where the hair loss research is heading today, which basically says, look, androgens have the potential to act as hair loss accelerants. No question of this. But you have to have certain preconditions in place for the androgens to come along and accelerate the effect. Yeah. I observationally, after 40 years of being in this community, do not see a disproportionately high number of men suffering male pattern baldness than I do in the outside world. I think it's the same, right?
Right.
And so when you look at it and you start to, you go, it's like there are threads that you start pulling on, and this is the challenge with many of these conversations is we need to talk about 20 bullet points and get to the end of those 20 bullet points, and nobody can say it's over forever. Yeah.
Right.
We need to be open to new information and new evidence and new thinking. Yeah. But it's very difficult when you get to the end of the 20 bullet points and said, so if primobolan or mastron cannot be amplified into DHT, physically impossible to do, and finasteride works by preventing testosterone being amplified into DHT, and mastron and primobolan have lower androgenic potential, then how is it happening? That's a really good question. By what mechanism of action is it possible? And then you go, but then, why when I go to the masters bodybuilding competitions and I look at the 50-year-old guys on stage, do they have somewhat similar hair profiles as the guys in the audience?
Right.
Yeah. There's all these uncalled questions that all I would simply argue is what I'm pressing back against is bro science that says mastron is a hair killer. I go, not so quickly. That's not a correct observation based on the clinical evidence, based on the observation. And people like myself, I lean into mastron preferentially. Have I experienced some degree of, reduction in hair follicle density after 20 years? Yes, but I would argue not worse than what I would have experienced if I had not opened this door ever. And all I'm simply trying to say in this type of conversation is, if anyone wants to step up and explain to me the mechanism by which this happens, I'm all ears. But right now we're at the point whereby people are unable to explain. We're at the point where they're simply saying, but I seen it, bro.
I think this is the answer. I'm not going to explain it like I know, but this is my hypothesis. Nobody's doing primo before they step on stage. They're doing mastron.
Sure.
And the stress induces the shedding effect, not androgenic alopecia. Sure. And they're confabulating the shedding effect with androgenic alopecia. For example, there were times where I just went on Anadrol and Tren at the same time. I lost a ton of hair. And I was like, well, neither of these drugs cause hair loss in me normally, but using them together does. That's weird. And then when I learned from you about the difference between actual androgenic alopecia and the shedding effect, and I was like, well, then that's the answer, is that this is a stress-induced temporary condition versus actual long-term trauma to the follicle. And it makes sense to me, the long-term stuff can be prevented with the RU4886.
What I would argue is this: hair loss is multifactorial.
Right.
So the answer is
11 things you have on your modeling, right? 11.
So the answer is really simple, and that's you write down a list of all the things you could plausibly do, and then you execute as many of those as you can practically. Right. Yeah. That's your best shot. Now, understanding that if you are genetically cursed, it doesn't matter what you do, you're screwed. Do you know what I mean? But the good news is, and this is not something I talk about very much today, but today in 2022, if it bothers you, then what I would argue you do is, as early as possible, then you come to Thailand and you drop $2,000 and you get an FUE hair transplant. Now, I know that sounds extreme, but historically,
they got them in Turkey too.
Yeah, correct. Historically, we had fairly agricultural procedures that weren't ideal, but it's getting better and better and better to the point whereby today, I don't know whether you know, so I have 4 of my teeth missing at the front. I'm having dental implants done. 4 of my teeth.
I remember you saying so.
Yeah, I'm really close to getting them put back in, but it takes time because the bone has to heal. The point I'm making, though, is I don't see a hair loss transplant procedure any differently than cosmetic surgery, dental surgery, or any different to breast augmentation at all. Like they're the same thing. So
no shame in it.
There's no shame in it. So just go and do it. But the argument would be, don't wait until it's so late that you are asking for 100% hair follicle replication. When you notice it and you say, look, I'm convinced that I'm seeing year on year a further reduction in hair follicle density, that's the point that you act. And when you add it up, all the expenses of things like laser light therapy and all these other things that you could argue for their efficacy on, they cost more than a hair transplant does. So
RU4886 is $80 a month.
So all of these
that's
things,
just that.
All of these things, what I would argue, if you sat down as a rational human being and looked at the effort that's required and the cost that's involved and the implications of it, I would be taking a hair transplant as the last resort thing and putting it far higher on the list of things to do than people think of today. Because in my opinion, the greatest risk here is you wait too late.
Right. It's the turkey place is supposed to fly you out and put you up for $2,000. I'm not trying to compare. I'm just saying that I'm agreeing with you that this is an affordable option for someone who's got $2,000 in a week.
Yeah,
they can get a better option.
We drop $600 on growth hormone and think nothing of it. Like I'm thinking, like, you know what, like, and my only message in this would be, look into the procedures. Things have changed in the last 10 years. The costs have come down. The efficacies have improved. And all I'm saying is, I don't think there's a person on the planet that's not aware of the option. But what I'm saying is most people see the option as the last thing you do. And I would argue as, well, why don't we take that and treat it like breast augmentation or dental transplant and just put it higher up on the list?
Now, you also mentioned this, I think it was you, about gyno, that your number one opinion about estrogen is that the only actual attributable side effect of estrogen is gyno. All the other side effects are actually
even that though is
AAS.
Even that though is
it's multifactorial.
It's the relationship between the androgen and estrogen ratio that causes gynecomastia, not the estrogen. And a simple example of that would be that you can take a man, give them finasteride, and induce gynecomastia. You're not raising estrogen in the consequence of doing that.
Down DHT.
Yeah. So in other words, that's proof that says, well, estrogen is involved, but it's the relationship between the two. You take that balance out, and no one has been able to explain to me or describe an estrogenic side effect. People describe things like this is estrogen, but that's not actually estrogen. That's something else within human physiology.
Right. So I think the model you put up was that the GH, the IGF-1, the progesterone, the estrogen, and the prolactin feed into gyno, and the DHT and androgens subtract from gyno. But I think where I was going with this was, your point is that right off the bat, people should get gyno surgery, and then you can handle a higher estrogen load and run more testosterone. I'm not saying that to make you sound irresponsible.
No, I've never actually said that, so I'm not sure where you got that one from. But but the premise would be, if you understand from day one what causes gynecomastia, it's a non-issue. Yeah. Right. I'm not opposed to gyno surgery, but I've never actually recommended it as a preventative model. That might be someone else. That's not me. Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's why I prefaced it with I wasn't sure that it was for people who want to do competitive bodybuilding.
I think other people have said that, and what I would argue is, if you were to look at the top 50 competitors in the world, I don't have this information. I'm speculating based on the individuals, and I would argue that a statistically large percentage of those individuals have actually taken that course. They have had their glands removed. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I luckily get cuts through my nipple when I get lean enough to actually step on stage. But if I didn't, I would definitely have went into the gyno route right away. Yeah. So I want to reiterate your point, because you keep circling back to this point. Just so I'm agreeing with you that every one of these, Merck, Lilly, Pfizer, they're going to have Coke, Pepsi, RC Cola.
Yeah,
so there's going to be the same exact drug, almost every fucking way possible, released over and over and over again, because there's these, every brand had to get their version of it. And then there's a bunch of them that went in the trash can because they sucked and they would never get FDA approved like Ment. And then what happened was they brought those back after the pro-hormone ban of 2004, I think, and marketed them as SARMs. When SARM, calling anything a SARM is basically like calling produce organic. Like, oh, this is organic, it's good for you. Anything made with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen is fucking organic. Likewise, any synthetic testosterone derivative is a SARM. It's a selective androgen receptor modulator. So everybody is selling the same fucking shit. It's cola. It's Coke, Pepsi, RC Cola. It doesn't matter what the name of it is. It's the same thing.
They are.
There's slight differences.
They are subtly different, and that's what I'm saying. It's within those differences that will determine which one of those that we lean into. Yeah.
Right. So the Primo versus Mastron is Coke versus Pepsi. And those are the two most similar drugs you can use.
So they are very similar. If we just very quickly, we're going to miss points here, but so they're both DHT derivatives. They're both injectable esterized steroid hormones. Neither one can convert to DHT. Neither one adds to your estrogen profile. Like, they both accrete protein tissue, and then we start to get into the subtle difference of these things. And it's in the subtleties that personal experience comes to the fore. And you say, like, I would argue that Mastron, for me, has a greater impact on mechanical activation, central nervous system activation. I feel like I'm a more capable lifter in the gym with Mastron. Now, I cannot point my finger based on the clinical literature as to exactly why that would be. They both, in theory, should contribute in that regard, but it is my opinion based on my experience and my exposure that I prefer Mastron's effect. And that's what I encourage people to do. What I'm trying to get people away from is this idea that says Ment is 1,000 times more anabolic than testosterone. Okay, like, that's just a completely unsupportable statement. And yet we wasted 50 years being led down that path, this drug versus that drug. They are effectively, as you say, competitors to each other, and we should view them through that lens, through that filter.
I mean, in the end, regardless of whatever the numbers are, like if it says Tren is 500 rating and Test is 100 rating, that doesn't mean that Tren at an equal amount is going to generate 5 times the muscle.
Okay.
It means that it has supposedly 5 times the potency, and that's only at extremely low doses that you wouldn't even use.
Tiny non-working doses. Agreed. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. So my audience base at this point in time is probably shutting down because in my experience, people last about an hour. So do you have any questions I enjoyed the conversation. Do you have any questions you want to finish off? Because if we keep going much longer, we'll end up with three people watching.
It's one of those things where I love talking shop. You're a brilliant man. I'd love to do this again sometime. I covered the big questions. I wanted to clarify your opinions on a few of those issues. It seems that you don't really have an opinion about Primo versus Mastron except for your personal preference. There isn't that. And then it seems that you're not opposed to RU486. You just don't see it as being clinically proven, and so thus it's not really something that you're.
All I would argue, people. Let me just explain one thing. Maybe I should explain this front. How all this began for me, understanding I'm not a doctor, I'm not a organic chemist, I'm not an androgen researcher. Is I was just listening to what people were saying and saying that doesn't make any fucking sense. You're like, I'm listening to people using all this big language and using all these terms, and it sounds really impressive, but logically, it doesn't make any sense. I'll give you the RU argument, and I understand that there's people out there that will argue otherwise. But here's the thing. It's very much like the GW1516 case where people would say, look, it failed standardized toxicity testing versus it was treated unfairly, right? You have to understand, by the time that drug was evaluated by Glaxo, right, it had some very promising clinical application on offer. They must have invested, I have no idea, I'm guessing, let's just say millions of dollars to that point, right? The likelihood of them just abandoning it and walking away because of some misunderstanding about the way standardized toxicity testing is done is highly unlikely. It's far more likely that Glaxo, being the pharmaceutical giant that they are, knew exactly what they were doing, and they tested it and it didn't meet the needs, and so they made a decision to walk away. Here's the problem with RU, and I'm not saying this is ironclad, but it is an interesting question. If you understand the billions of dollars on offer for whoever comes up with a cure for hair loss that doesn't carry with it the potential deleterious consequences of DHT systemic blocking, billions of dollars, right? It doesn't make any rational sense that here was a drug that does what it does and someone hasn't tried to fucking clone it or slip past the patent. Like, that does basically what it does. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars here. You know what I mean? I would argue that doesn't make any sense. Like, there has to be a story there. I do not believe that the pharmaceutical industry that are involved in hair loss research haven't invested millions of dollars into looking at those types of drugs with such high profiles, right? And made decisions that they have walked away from. Logically,
so you're saying that the reason why you don't think RU works is because if it worked, we would have heard about it before, or someone would be pushing it
from a commercial
through the trials faster with bribery.
From a commercial perspective, yeah, the research wouldn't be dead.
Well, melanotan works great, and that never got used.
Oh, so what I would argue, though, is what they figured out, that it's not androgens that is the problem.
It's not what?
It's not androgens that's the problem. They know that.
I see what you're saying.
The hair loss researchers know that the solution is not androgen blocking. And so when you look at the hundreds of initiatives that are currently underway in hair loss research, almost none of them are to do with DHT.
Okay,
right?
I see what you're saying.
So what I'm arguing is that the people who are in the trenches that are investing their time and money looking for solutions here and here, well aware of what's in offer, they like their rule number one across the blackboard is forget fucking androgens. It's not androgens. And again, it's purely anecdotal, but our tribe is a really interesting little cohort to look at. Why the fuck are we not all bald? It's a good question. We should all be bald as eggs, right? But we're not. And again, I'm repeating myself. I apologize. I would argue, despite our outrageous behaviors with androgens, on a hair loss perspective, I don't think we have greater hair loss levels than the general person. So what the reason I don't believe in RU is simply this, and that is I don't believe it's androgens that's the problem. It's other preconditions that exist, that if those preconditions do exist, that you're basically going to accelerate the process with the introduction of androgens. But if they don't exist, then the androgens in and as of themselves are not the problem.
But if you did have, you can mitigate the acceleration with an anti-androgen.
Correct. And this is where you're at a pathway. You say, look, I have three choices. Either I ignore the preconditions and go with the DHT blocking, option one, which is what finasteride does. Option two is you ignore the androgens and go with the solution to the preconditions. Or option three is you do both. Now,
option four is you just get a hair transplant.
Or option four is you get a hair transplant. And what I would argue is, well, surely fucking like option 2, 3, and 4 make more sense than ignoring everything else and just DHT blocking. You know?
Right.
And so my solution all along has been, this is a multifactorial problem that requires a multifactorial solution. And one of the line items in there, we need to talk about hair transplants and bring our tribe up to date with what has happened in that space in the last 10 years.
Yeah, 8 years ago, I did a video and I had a model that was ketoconazole, minoxidil, oral finasteride, and topical dutasteride. And I found that when I just swapped out the topical 5-alpha reductase inhibitors for just blockade, of the receptor with the RU586,
Sure.
skipping the middleman so that the DHT versus all that bullshit didn't matter because you're blocking the receptor on the follicles. And of course, it's been a concern that I'm introducing an androgen receptor blocker, but on periods in which I stopped using it, I didn't see a dramatic change in growth or stimulation of muscle tissue, as if I was getting 100% systemic deactivation of all my androgens.
You did ask that question. I didn't answer it. Let me answer that question, and then we'll wind this up. So what I would argue is, based on the evidence that we have, there is no quality evidence that says DHT blocking impacts on hypertrophic outcomes. There are enough fragments to say that doesn't appear to be the case. However, what I would argue is that force production and hypertrophy are different pathways. They are, in fact, different things. And you can correlate them and say, look, a greater cross-section area of muscle tissue, provides greater potential in force production. That's fair. But they're actually two different discussions. So what I would say is, what the current evidence says is that DHT blocking, whether it's finasteride, dutasteride, whatever mechanism that you use to do that, doesn't appear to have a deleterious effect on hypertrophic outcomes, skeletal muscle tissue.
Right.
But it
because
does appear.
DHT doesn't, the DHT does not get into the cell. It doesn't bind to the nucleus. It doesn't cause transcription or translation, because I think it's called 3-oxy superoxide dismutase is the enzyme or something that breaks down DHT once it gets inside the cell, which it does not do to normal testosterone.
So what I would argue is, however, the inverse is true for force production. There is a reasonable body of evidence that says, look, if you're a power lifter, if you're a strength athlete, then DHT blocking may well have a deleterious effect on your particular goals. And so this is the specificity of training discussion that you need to have. Many of the things between powerlifters and bodybuilders are similar, but there are separation points, and DHT blocking is one of those separate pathways.
Which is why I've always steered away from the finasteride and the dutasteride for that reason. However, with the RU, because it blocks the receptor, not the conversion of test to DHT, it should have no effect except for if it gets systemic through the scalp. Then it would have a catastrophic effect. I've just not noticed an effect. And I would think that it does not get into the system.
And that ultimately is my point is, so you read the clinical literature, we look at our historical anecdotal observation, and you deploy it and make a decision based on what happens when you do it. You're doing exactly what I consider to be evidence-based practice. So
and I guess I'm asking you what your opinion is about it getting systemic. I know what my opinion is.
I have never used RU. I've never recommended RU as like everybody should use it, because I don't believe that androgens cause hair loss. That's just my opinion.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I cannot speak to it with authority, because I would need to have used it to say whether I felt there was a difference.
Okay.
What I recommend people do is they leave DHT blocking to the last piece they put on the chessboard. Yeah. And what I find, observationally at least, is most people that deal with the shampoo they use and oxidative stress and they go down the list, they go, I don't feel a need to deploy DHT blocking agents or DHT blocking strategies because I'm not experiencing androgenetic alopecia. Plus, and then this is the big plus, because people that follow my models follow relatively moderate models, we remove hair shedding from the table. In my experience, hair shedding is a consequence of pushing the boundaries. You don't typically experience hair shedding following the basal model. You're only experiencing it under extreme stress. And even then, I would argue it's not the androgens, it's the sum total of all our behaviors together. So anyway, very interesting conversation. I apologize, but I think we should call it up. Otherwise, we will, as I said, we will bore everyone to tears listening.
Do you have any questions for me before we go?
I think what I would like to do, you mentioned before, you enjoy conversations like this. If you're open to it, maybe we can organize another session where we can flip the tables a little bit. I can ask you some questions. How about that?
Well, that was supposed to be what today was, right? I don't always have an opportunity like this, so I got a little carried away. I'm sorry about that.
No. So maybe we can pick that up in a couple of weeks. We can, I'll come to the table with a bunch of questions, and we'll ask Dr. Todd Lee his opinion on these things.
All right, fantastic. This was
cool.
Great.
Awesome. I enjoyed the call very much, buddy. Let me
too,
let me sign off here, and we'll come back in a couple of weeks with another session.